So welcome, Neil and Konstantin.
Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes, so let's start right away and shift gears a bit. So I want to start talking about the macro perspective of the European startup and tech ecosystem. And in the end, we're here to discuss how to make Europe the most entrepreneurial continent. So what's your assessment of where Europe is actually today in terms of startups, venture capital, and technology? And what if we start with you, Neil?
Thanks, Mika. I first want to correct the record and say I'm one of the founders. There are three of us who are founders, and I don't want to be hogging all the glory from my partners. I think that when I think of where we are today, it's almost beyond what we might have imagined 10 years ago. To imagine that in 2020 you'd have not one but two European companies that trade at valuations above or around $50 billion. And valuation is one metric. I think of it as a proxy for how ubiquitous your product is, how indispensable your product is. And the world awards you that kind of evaluation. But to think of the fact that we're at that place, that the number of people working in startups around Europe is growing dramatically and is over 2 million people now across Europe, and that's 40% more than it was just in 2016. That the jobs that are being created by startups are now starting to make a significant dent in the economy. That would have been really hard to imagine 10 years ago, but I'd say we're also just at the beginning of where we're going to be 10 years from now.
Got it. Konstantin, do you share the view of Neil? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I do. I must say I share less the amazement. I think this has been developing for quite a while, and more and more funding has been available over time, and we've seen bigger companies and more unicorns emerging from Europe. I do think it's still vulnerable in a sense that there's still a lot of public money in the system, and the connectivity of Europe is still not very high. So do we really see entrepreneurs go back and become venture capitalists? Do we see governments really interacting with these new types of companies? Do we see that governments fully understand how important this is? I think there's still quite a lot to be done. But on the whole, I'm really proud what's being achieved. And when we set up we first wrote the Startup Manifesto for Europe and set up the Digital Leaders Club with founders of Skype and of Spotify and others. Then when we're really looking for role models in Europe now, I think there are sufficient role models, and these are really becoming very serious companies. And I think now we're not talking about startups anymore, but about a very sophisticated tech sector that is now proving to larger parts of the economy that this is very serious, that these are the jobs of the future, and that these are the companies that will keep us competitive. And then last point, I think COVID has really helped us bring forward a lot of these developments. Everything becoming remote, from education to healthcare to work. A lot of these innovations were already there, but they were not implemented. And now COVID has really accelerated that process.
Got it. You mentioned, Konstantin, about role of governments, and let's come back to that in a second. But before that, maybe I'm curious to understand, like, if we think about the past 20 years, or let's say 10 years, what have been the biggest changes, whether they are good or bad, you have witnessed when you both have worked with startups for many years? Maybe, Konstantin, if you can start.
On the government side, I think, when we did the digital agenda, it was seen as a vertical. Like you had electricity or energy, and you had telecoms and transport, and we tried to say this is transversal. It's going to be transformational to all sectors of the economy, of society, and that was just not generally accepted. I think that's now generally accepted. It's now accepted that this is highly strategic, and we might come back to that as well, between the US and China and Europe. in many parts of the world, the IT infrastructure and services on top, the platforms are highly strategic, and that was not the case 5 to 10 years ago.
Good afternoon from where I am in Berlin today, and thank you for joining us from wherever you may be. I'm so pleased to be part of this exciting discussion today called Making Startups Strategic Priority for Europe, What Will It Take? We have an esteemed lineup of panelists today who don't need too much introduction, so I'll keep them short. Joining me today, we have Dr. Jörg Kukies, the State Secretary at Germany's Federal Ministry of Finance. We have 2 members of European Parliament. We have Eva Maidel and Eva Kiley, and we have Gerard de Graaf, Director for the Digital Single Market in Directorate General, Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. So let's dive straight in. Entrepreneurs and executives at some of Europe's most successful technology startups have urged local governments to change laws to make employee stock options more attractive in order to better compete with Silicon Valley. I'd like to direct my first question to Dr. Kukies about employee stock option schemes. Is this a strategic priority in Germany? And can we see employee stock option schemes become a pan-European movement?
I can obviously only speak for us in Germany, and I would clearly answer with yes. The German coalition government has agreed that this will be implemented during this legislature, and we will stay true to our word. And we are currently working with our friends and colleagues in the economics ministry on preparing a draft for legislation, and that will be out within a matter of days rather than weeks. So we are very, if I'd been a bit more lucky, I could have presented you the sort of intro with the content. Unfortunately, we're still in the final stretch of coordination, but we're very far advanced, and will present a piece of legislation that will include incentives to increase the distribution of shares to startup employees, but it will contain more to incentivize startup investments in our country as well. So this is an important question, but it's not the only question.
I'm very excited to hear that we've got a bit of breaking news first thing on the panel about kind of, the legislation kind of coming within a matter of days. That's very encouraging to the startups in Germany and the ecosystem here. To what extent, what has kind of helped you drive that ambition also to kind of make stock in, employee stock options schemes a priority in Germany?
Well, being in Berlin helps because obviously we have a very large ecosystem of startups traveling to Munich, Hamburg, Düsseldorf, other countries, other cities in our country, Frankfurt and many others helps as well. So I think it's a very obvious topic. When we took office in Germany, we do have a problem which is called among experts dry income, where you get essentially, if you have an illiquid ownership stake, you get taxed immediately, but obviously you can't sell anything to account for that and to pay it. So basically you're trapped with a liquidity outflow and an illiquid asset, so that you have a problem of matching the cash outflow with the wealth creation that you have. And that really was highlighted by many startups, investors in startups, law firms, tax experts as a fundamental problem of startups to attract talent. And so we've been working hard to find a rule that would work on the one side, but also avoid abuse and be still compliant with the EU state aid laws, which is also very important.
To what extent has this legislature been kind of, done in conjunction or in discussion with CEOs and entrepreneurs from the local ecosystem?
Oh, massively. I mean, we of course need the input, and we're very keen to understand the input. And what's very encouraging is that the community of startups and their advisors very well understood that this is not a free-for-all. We need rules that also avoid, tax arbitrage, that avoid social contributions to be curtailed. So in that sense, we found a very receptive group of startups that we had very intense discussions with, And yeah, hopefully the result that we'll present shortly will be a good thing that increases the competitiveness of the German market and gets more startups to come to our country.
A joy to be joining you at Not Optional. My name is Caroline Hyde. I have the great pleasure of being an anchor for Bloomberg Television right here in very grey New York. But today we have got a fireside chat for you. So I know the fires are roaring across in Estonia. Next with, of course, Taavet Hinrikus joins us, co-founder, chairman now of TransferWise, and also to join us in this free-flowing conversation that I know it will be, John Collison, of course, co-founder of Stripe, who's currently in Europe as well, I think, especially for this sort of an event. But I want this to be fast-flowing, free-talking, enjoyable, and really putting to bear what we are wondering about, where Europe is at in terms of its tech infrastructure, its tech investment, and its tech talent. And kudos to Slush and to Index Ventures for putting this event on. And let's get straight to it, because gentlemen, it is a joy to be joined by both of you. And Taavet, kick us off, if you will, because we all spend our times trying to compare how Europe is compared to Silicon Valley. How is it doing versus China? From your perspective, you've been in the game for a while, having built your business from scratch and now billions in terms of valuation. What does Europe look like to you as an angel investor and as a founder?
I think Europe is doing awesome right now. So if I think back when we started TransferWise almost 10 years ago, it was way, way different. You know, we actually went to US to raise our money. We raised seed A, B, C from US. We actually got our D round and later from Europe. If you think about talent, if you think about infrastructure, a lot has changed. So I think we're in a golden age of Europe. The capital is available. We have more raw talent in Europe than we have in the US. Also, I think people's attitudes are finally changing. It used to be that when you fail as a founder in Europe, some people look at it like, "Oof, this kind of stinks. Like, you know, this guy failed." Like, I think we're starting to embrace failure a little bit more. So, you know, it's just a matter of time until we're really going to catch up to US and China, in my mind.
John, does Silicon Valley care? You're a European who left for the US to start raising your money for founding Stripe. Does Silicon Valley care about how big Europe is?
I think Europe cares too much what Silicon Valley thinks. I think that there tends to be a lot of talking about catching up to the US and China and various things like that. But as Taavet said, the fundamentals are fabulous in that, you know, you have, as a bloc, Europe has the largest density of software engineering talent. We know there's a really strong base of hard tech investment. I mean, we look at the progress here on the, you know, the Oxford COVID vaccine and lots of other things as we look at, you know, AI. It's where Facebook's, you know, AI headquarters in Paris and things like that. But I think fundamentally we kind of look at it from the wrong perspective with too much comparison. Like, yes, obviously it's the case that it's gotten so much better. You know, I grew up in Ireland and then, you know, first moved to the United States in, I guess, 2009. In 2009, when I left the US, it was a barren wasteland of a fundraising environment. I mean, you know, the notion that you could scrape together a Series A from, you know, a small handful of investors and maybe government grants or something, that was an achievement. And now you have, like Taavet said, there Series D and Series E from European investors and these very large investment rounds without really anyone batting an eye. And so what I get excited about are all the specific areas where I think, you know, European startups are best set up to compete and to win on a global basis, and we can get into some of those.
Yeah, I mean, delve into that, John, because fintech was always what was held up, lauded as the area of expertise. London is the hub of that, but you've built your fintech in Silicon Valley. Like, where is the opportunities in particular with Europe, do you think?
Well, we haven't in that we obviously got our start in the United States. We're in college for it there, but, you know, now our international headquarters is in Dublin. We have a large business in Europe. We actually just announced the acquisition of a company called Paystack last week. They are headquartered in Nigeria and they are building the Stripe for Africa. And I actually think expanding to African countries is one of the very big opportunities that European companies have available to them. As you mentioned, fintech, I think that's a big one. Actually, Taavet, I'd be curious for your thoughts on this. But I think it's really interesting to contrast the difference in the American mindset towards enabling all this stuff versus the European mindset, where Americans have a bit of this view. There's the famous Ronald Reagan line that the 9 scariest words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," and you can kind of see that in not much happens in the way of enabling frameworks and standards and technology. Whereas I think in the European landscape, you tend to get much more in the way of active regulators looking to enable markets developing. And so with fintech, it isn't that fintech just accidentally sprung up in Europe. You had the notion of passporting, where you can get licensed in one countries and then passport it to other European countries, which is something both Stripe and TransferWise take advantage of. You've all the developments with PSD2, you've the banking regulatory sandboxes and things like this. But there's lots of active work that made things like Stripe and TransferWise possible from a framework perspective. And I get excited about there are probably future areas where we should be applying that thinking. Look at VAT, which is a mess right now. Look at digital identity, where we need much more to be improved. And so that would be probably one example. I would say, there is an approach that brought fintech about, and we can probably take that approach and apply it to other areas.
Tarvik, your thoughts?
I mean, I think, John, you said a lot of this already. I would just maybe start also from actually, if you're building a global business, which, both of our companies are global, we have more than a dozen offices around the world, it's actually a whole lot easier to manage that from Europe. There's a reason you're camping out in Europe right now. It's just easier. Let's be honest about it. Time zone wise, you can call California and you can call Singapore in the same day. Try doing it from one of these places. So it's just, logistically much easier. But, we've gotten a lot right for fintech regulation. I mean, in the US, for many things, you have state-by-state regulation. In Europe, it's an equal sized opportunity. I say we're talking 500 million people in both, well, a bit less, but, in Europe, you have one regulator. It's no accident that we chose UK to be our headquarters, because the UK regulator already back then was showing signs of promise. And I still think FCA is keeping the leading spot as a regulator, and the way passporting works. The way European Union is making a digital single market. I think there's a lot more to be done, but they're actively trying to create an environment. They have made it a much more level playing field. If you look at, we were the first non-bank to get access to the payments infrastructure in the UK. We still haven't gotten it everywhere in Europe, and there's more that a regulator should do. But I think there's a lot happening, and the world is also paying attention and copying a lot what's been done in the UK. So many regulators are saying that, hey, the FCA is our model, and we're trying to copy that. And, I think fintech and everything around it, fintech, insurance, and so on. Also, if you think of companies, we have Stripe, and, we have another similar company in Europe called Adyen. I don't even know which one is bigger. So I think Europe is ahead in fintech and everything around this. I think much more to come in various deep tech areas, whether it goes to health-related fields or climate, just the raw engineering talent coming from universities that will build a lot of exciting things.
Stripe is bigger in case you're wondering, yeah. But do you think there's also something, Tavis, where getting, companies that get their start in the US, you can live there and drive for 1,000 kilometers in any direction, and you're still in, exactly the same kind of culture, from which you started, more or less. Whereas pretty early on, you have companies that grew up in the European environment working on cross-border, working on multi-currency, multi-language, working on localizing their products. And so I think you tend to see more of these globally minded companies, even at the Series A stage.
I totally agree. It's a mixed blessing. If you start a company in Europe, you end up, you might be lucky starting it in UK, which means you can grow this far. You might be unlucky starting in Estonia, which means you can only grow this far until you have to go elsewhere. If you start in the US, you have a huge market to go after, but that means you end up building a large business, a large organization that really can't think of languages, even time zones might be a challenge. Versus in Europe, you get a kick in the butt very quickly and you have to go outside. So I do think it is a structural advantage for us. And I think the European companies have become pretty good at figuring out their playbooks on this. And at the same time, we can see US companies, I think the last example was Robinhood, that figured Europe is too hard and we'll go back to US. So great. I'm sure there's going to be a dozen baby Robin Hoods coming up in Europe soon.
Is Europe, though, Tavet, making its life more difficult with Brexit? Is it making your life more difficult? Do you think that the regulators will be as seamless? Or is it affecting things?
Favorite topic: elections and Brexit.
And the virus.
Let me talk about elections next, please. So Brexit, it's obviously a huge issue for one country, and a bit more of an issue for one union. I think in the tech world, actually, I would say, if you look at Europe, it doesn't matter. It matters for UK and makes life harder in the UK, but Europe as a whole, London loses, Paris wins. I think, I believe we're living in a post-Silicon Valley world. We have many Silicon Valleys in Europe, London being one, Paris, Berlin, Tallinn. Like in Estonia, we have 5 unicorns for 1 million people. I mean, bloody hell, that's like, everyone has a personal unicorn soon. So I think, we're going to have many more tech capitals in Europe, which is good. Brexit will make things harder, and it'll make things more harder for London and UK. But I think overall, we're going to move on. And, so people in tech are good at building. And if you're building, then, you just tend to overcome whatever gets thrown in the way.
And I can hardly keep up with your building, both of you. And talk to us about Stripe and the way it's evolving. I mean, you're now helping businesses have their own credit cards. You've been making purchases over in Africa, as you say, John. Your perspective on what policy barriers you're finding as you move into new regions such as Africa, as you're looking at expanding these new types of offerings. What more could Europe do potentially from a policy barrier perspective? Does anything need to get down?
Oh, absolutely. And it actually gets to the Brexit point, right? Where I think you could live too much in conceptual space and imagine that like we had this neat, orderly EU where everything was colored in on a map before, and then the UK exited it, and now everything is really hard and non-standardized. And look, there are kind of real, social, personal, business costs to Brexit, but we shouldn't kid ourselves about how standardized everything was before and how standardized everything is within the EU right now. And so, we talk a lot about the European single digital market. That is more of a conceptual aspiration than a reality. Cross-border commerce within the EU borders is still sub 20%, which seems kind of bonkers when you think that we should have solved all the barriers to intra-EU trade right now. And so just within our small parochial doing business online corner of things, absolutely standardizing across payment methods. SEPA was a good start for bank transfers. But one of the big things people come to Stripe to do is to make it so that they can accept any European payment methods. That's what we're doing. We would love to see more standardization across sales tax, making it easy for a business to operate and to sell to any other business in Europe. Like I mentioned, we'd love to see more standardization across digital identity. The fact that both Tavid and I in our businesses, you need to do KYC checks or validate someone's identity for them to participate in the internet economy. There is no good online way to do that right now. And so I think that's rightly something that regulators and various businesses are looking at. But again, with Brexit, it's not like we went from a world where everything was perfectly standardized within the EU to now that's falling over. I think we actually still have a lot of, even just within EU countries, standardization to do. And that then applies as we go kind of further afield to regions like, expanding into Africa with Paystack, or we've lots of other international expansion happening. It's that same set of challenges that you need to do, where Stripe is fundamentally about providing a ubiquity and translation layer where everything works smoothly, but everything is different underneath the hood. And so we need to do the work to enable that.
Tava, any policy wishes? You had your perspective?
I mean, first, John, if you mentioned ID verification, I think the leading ID verification companies are all in Europe. So, ping me later and I can put you in touch. I think when it comes to policy, lots is right, but there's still more to do. I think, the prime thing that I would think about is really making it a level playing field in Europe when it comes to banks and fintechs. There's a lot about access to payment infrastructure, which is still limited to banks only. I mentioned how we got access in the UK, but that took us about 7 years of lobbying and then 2 years of building. Great thing is that now everyone else has an easier way, and we're very happy to pave the way in other countries. But that's something where regulators could really come in and help. Digital single market is exists, but lots more to do. I mean, maybe I would add here labor, making the labor market more unified. You know, hiring, firing people is still very complicated in some countries, easier in others. You know, also the topic of stock options. You know, sadly, if you have people in every European country, that means it's a big mess because every country treats it differently from a tax point of view. So more to be done, you know, to make it a more single market, but we have the beginnings in place.
Good morning, everyone, to day 2 of Not Optional. I'm Michael Stothard. I'm the editor of Sifted. So yesterday was a fantastic day at the event, as we've just seen from the highlight reel. But for those who missed it, I'm just going to do a quick 3-minute recap on some of the highlights. We had some breaking news, very excitingly. We had Jörg Kukis from the German Finance Ministry saying that the German stock option policy will be published in the coming days, something that entrepreneurs and Not Optional have been fighting for many years. So that's a big victory. We also heard from the Commission that the Startups Nation Standard will be launched during the Portuguese presidency next year of the Council, helping member states deliver startup-friendly policies. We also heard from the founders of TransferWise and Stripe on the great regulatory landscape for fintechs in Europe and how maybe that can be extended to other sectors. And we also had Neil Reimer and Konstantin Van Orange about the sheer ambition of European founders at the moment and how that has really escalated in the last few years. So it was a fantastic day. And today is going to be no less exciting. We're going to explore what it will take to get more IPOs in Europe, which is a huge issue. And we're going to be hearing from the Portuguese and the French governments about their plans for making Europe the most entrepreneurial continent. So without further ado, we'll go to the first panel, which is absolutely super. The topic is unlocking investment in startups and the role of government. And what we're going to be trying to do is tease out some of the ways in which our panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, think that governments could be doing more to stimulate investment in Europe. So on our extremely esteemed panel, we have Reshma Suni, the founder of Seedcamp. We have Johannes Reck, the founder of Get Your Guide. And we have, I'm afraid there was a last minute change. Jean-David Malo from the EIC couldn't make it due to personal reasons, but Stefan Wacki from the EIC has manfully stepped in to replace him. So thank you very much to the panel. And I'm going to start with Johannes, who's representing the founders here as a founder of Get Your Guide. I'm going to just ask, what, as a founder, as a very successful founder, what do you want from governments? And what do you think governments in Europe need to be doing better to create, to stimulate funding in Europe?
Hi, Michael. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on the Not Optional panel today. My name is Johannes. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Get Your Guide. We're the world's largest marketplace for travel experiences. You know, we raised around 600 million euros to date, and we've been around for more than 10 years now. So I have a pretty good historic view of how the landscape came along. I would like to outline 3 points that I think are incredibly important to stimulating the European startup ecosystem over the next 10 years. And let me start by saying that I couldn't be more excited about the next decade. Berlin, where I'm from, has transformed massively due to tech. We're a different city, and we're a much better city today because of technology and technology investment. And I think that is a fantastic role model for a lot of other cities in Europe. The 3 most important things that I see for us right now in Europe is, number 1, investment. So there are a lot of voices today that say, Europe already has a lot of capital. Capital is available for founders. And that is absolutely correct. It's a lot more abundant than where it was 10 years ago. But bear in mind, 10 years ago, no one could raise a round. Today, a couple of good companies can raise a round, but in a lot of sectors, you still have really subdued funding and a lot of cash constraint. And even if you go to the later rounds, Get Your Guide announced a 114 million euro convertible note yesterday. I can tell you we were again talking to 10 US investors in this round and not a single European one, because I couldn't even name a European investor who could cut a convertible check at that size. And I think we're losing out massively. We're losing out massively for our startups who want to raise this capital and who should remain in European ownership and not go into American ownership. But we're also losing out on the side of the European pension funds, of the European insurances, who are all currently regulated in a way that they cannot even participate for the most part in these type of funds. And I think that is a vacuum that needs to be filled, and that is a problem that needs to be addressed. Second is talent. Not Optional was founded as an initiative, because of the lack of our frameworks that we have around incentivizing young people or even old people to join startups. And the time is now. I mean, if you think about COVID-19, we're seeing a dramatically accelerated shift towards digital, and we must incentivize these new jobs, with the right incentives. And the right incentives are shares, the right incentives are options, and we need frameworks and fair taxation that is competitive across Europe, ideally in a harmonized way. And my last point is around regulation. We have allowed large US tech companies to dominate Europe, and they take by far the largest share in all of the basic infrastructure, whether that is cloud computing, a search engine, whether that is app stores. And that makes it very hard for young companies like Get Your Guide or like Spotify to compete on an even and equitable basis. And we need to come up with much faster and better regulatory frameworks to ensure that there is an even level playing field, that whether I'm Google Travel or Apple Music, I actually compete on fair and the same terms against a Spotify or against a Get Your Guide. And I think that is something that will be increasingly important as the coronavirus has concentrated even more power around a couple of tech companies that still remain unregulated in the US and remain unregulated in Europe.
Thanks, Johannes. Stefan, what do you think of those 3 points? And do you agree that those are some of the weaknesses of Europe that need to be addressed, and indeed possibly are being addressed by the Commission at the moment?
Yes, good morning. I think indeed on the first point on investment, which is basically my area of focus, I would say this is what the whole logic of creating the AIC and upping our game in terms of our interventions when it comes to support to funds has been taking place. I mean, just to give you a bit of an idea of the gap that still exists today, in spite of the ground that has been covered over the past 10, 15 years. In 2019, the US venture capital market was about $56 billion, when in Europe, in the EU, we raised 11.2 billion euros. So this basically fivefold gap between America and Europe continues to be, I would say, one of the reasons why this investment gap continues to exist, and why it is so difficult for rounds to find the necessary capital in Europe to be raised. And this is where we believe is the major role that the Commission can actually play in order to try to plug that gap. The idea here is, of course, not to crowd out the private sector. On the contrary, is to try to put in place a scheme that will crowd in the private sector by intervening at a moment when the risk level perceived by the market is so high that there is very, very few takers on the market to actually put money in those companies. And the idea here is to try, by putting our money first, by putting down patient capital and using financial structures or instruments and so on to crowd in private investors, either from the outset when we enter into those companies, or later, since we will also support companies with the necessary grant money to de-risk some of their research and development costs that they still are encountering at the beginning of their lives. So this is basically what we do. Another aspect, of course, of this investment gap is, of course, that the investment gap has also a qualitative aspect. I think it is not often highlighted, but this is something we are very, very concerned about in the European Commission, in the EIC, since we believe that the fact that there is a lack of capital in the VC market in comparison to the US, for example, create a bias towards low risk investment. And when you have, I would say, a much more liquid market with a lot more risk takers, a lot more capital around, you have a lot more risk takers. And as a consequence, you have, I would say, more bets that are being put on high risk, game changing ideas that push from technology from the lab to the market, even in areas that appear to be rather long shots. And that we see that in the US, we see that also in other geographies, like, for example, Israel, when you have a very vibrant VC market. But this is very difficult to see in Europe. And this is where we believe we can make a particular contribution also by concentrating and focusing our money in that particular segment of the market, when we can help this game-changing, high-risk idea emerge and get the necessary funding in order for them to demonstrate their worth and demonstrate their value on the market. Of course, none of this can happen if we do not also stimulate the right ecosystems at national and European level. And we need, of course, therefore, to do that, since many initiatives exist at national, regional, municipal level to support innovation programs, to support companies. We need to connect to those instead of trying to replace them out of Brussels. We need to give them the support they need in order to amplify their impact and better connect them across Europe in order to basically leverage their strengths and plug the gaps where they do exist. So this is basically where we see the added value of what we can provide at European level. So it's mostly a quantitative, a qualitative, and a networking impact that we are trying to generate by using the resources of the EIC. Just to give you an idea, we will probably have between 2020 and 2027 at the end of the program, the capacity to put on the market about 3.5 billion to 4 billion euros in venture capital, which is not minor.
Were you, I mean, deploying 3 to 3.5 billion in VC is obviously an enormous number, and shows that the Commission is kind of going on the front foot in terms of investing, and there's this move towards direct investing as well. Could you talk a bit about why this more activist approach has been taken? Because there are lots of different models. Obviously, there's creating just a good framework for venture to exist. There's investing in LPs, there's co-investing, there's direct investing. What was kind of the problem before, and why has there been this shift?
Well, I mean, what we have done, I can speak quite at length about them and what they have actually delivered and what they have actually not delivered. Basically, what we have done over the past 10 years is funds basically entering there as LPs through the European Investment Fund, acting as our mandator. This has worked very well, and the EIF has become, I would say, a major funder of the market in Europe. I would say it's present in most of the funds that are emerging in Europe. But what we have not been able to do is to, well, one of the themes that I think we will discuss today is tap, I would say, considerable institutional money to come into the market, which has led to a gap in funding still very much there, in spite of our leverage effect, if you wish, of our interventions alongside existing funds. So we have not managed to break that entry into the institutional money. In particular, when we look at pension funds or insurance companies, they remain extremely shy to enter the market on the VCs. I mean, it's due to a number of reasons. Let's not get into that right now. And we have been trying also to stimulate that through the IF, for example, by creating the initiative Venture EU, which is a European fund of funds, in order to try to catalyze that money and make the case for entering into the VC market. But this has not played out as well as we had thought. But I mean, like I said, there is a quantitative aspect which is related to how come the market in Europe is so much smaller than in the US, but there is also a qualitative one. And the qualitative one is I would say the general aversion to risk, which is also connected to the role of this institutional money in Europe. And that we have not been able to fundamentally change, in the sense that the logic, when your skin is in the game, private money is in the game, your perception of risk remains quite punitive when we are talking about the type of game-changing ideas, the kind high technology, high risk type of ideas that are emerging from labs across Europe, where we continue to be very, very good at. Europe produces a lot of research. It's actually on the par with the US, ahead of China still, on what our research networks can actually produce, but we have difficulties to go from the lab to the market, and companies are being created more than in the US, but actually these companies do not have the capacity to scale, and especially at the crucial first stages of development, they lack the necessary high risk capital available that you find either in America or more and more in China, or in certain ecosystems that are more favored. And our interventions have just brought more money to basically to a table in which you have basically the same number of deals that are considered to be investment ready by the market. In other words, one of a consequence of our interventions is that we just have the same companies now equipped with more money, thanks to our intervention, chasing the same deals, because everybody ranks the deal in terms of risk exactly the same way on the market. And therefore, we have not managed to shift the discussion here. What DIC is intended to do is to increase the pipeline. So fundamentally, what we are trying to do here is to say, okay, look, instead of giving money to VCs, and thanks to this money, you will chase all the same deal with an increased amount of money, which has been what we have been doing before, is to tell them, okay, we are also going to work on increasing the pipeline of companies that you will consider investment ready, because we are ready to come in early, take the high risk at the beginning of the scale-up process, and therefore provide you after some time with, I would say, a greater number of companies in which you will be able to invest. So it does not mean that we will stop doing the interventions that we used to do. So therefore, the indirect type of intervention, we'll continue to do that, but we need to complement it with a direct one in order to increase the pipeline. Otherwise, we do not resolve the problem.
Reshma, as one of the most active European investors out there, is this what Europe needs? Does it need more government money doing direct investments, increasing the pipeline, smaller checks for lots of different companies? Is this positive?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of two ways of looking at anything government, right? And I think our perspective on it is a more optimistic and working with. So yes, I think it's broadly positive. And I think the key word in what Stefan said at the very beginning and is crowding out, or they want to crowd in. And I think that's it, right? Like I think that's where the private sector gets more up in arms. It's when the private sector feels crowded out, and I think it's sort of well proven what sort of private sort of commercial interests do for the economy and job creation and sort of returns and so forth. So I think if that is the North Star of the government, I think it is, in all our sort of work with them over the past decade plus, then absolutely it's a positive, but it needs to be, it needs to remain that North Star. And I think everything sort of Stefan described, and probably particularly the critique of where VC money goes, I think it's fair, right? A lot of the VC money tends to go, and we're sort of flag bearers of that. In our model is we go where it's easier to commercialize. That's our model, and we don't, we make no apologies of it. And so, we need the help of Stefan and sources of capital like that to help us crowd in when it is possible for our money to come in, given what our parameters and mandates are. Just I mean, it's interesting with working with government or not. I mean, I think if you look at the US, they've woken up very late to what European entrepreneur community has been doing the last 15 years. Is, I think, we all said sort of 15 years ago or so, we can't, policy will happen, regulation will happen. Either we have a voice in it or we're impacted by it. And so versus I see, as I'm American as well, I see my sort of American friends in the industry just in the last 5 years with clearly what's been happening over there sort of said same thing. Either we sit on the sidelines and we're going to get impacted, and we all have, or we're a voice in it. And so thinking back again, Europe does not have the whole concept of endowments, right? This is not, and we don't talk, I know we talked about pensions, but endowments are massive in America. Universities are money-making businesses. That's what they're, if McDonald's and Starbucks is a real estate company, then universities are, hyper capital making companies. And that just doesn't exist in Europe, right? We think about sort of cost of education differently in the right way, I would say. And then secondly, the pension world doesn't exist. So I mean, sort of 13, 14 years ago when we raised money, it was all private money, but we couldn't scale just on that. And so when we said, all right, if endowments don't exist, then American endowments won't necessarily invest in Europe, and pension, all the regulation and other reasons prohibit them, then what? And so we started that dialogue with the European Investment Fund, which has been, an incredible backer, as Stefan said, and will do immensely well. I think they're the largest shareholder in UiPath, for example, because they are LPs in Early Bird, Credo Ventures, and Seed Campus as well. So, and that company is out of Romania, global now. So the EI's done amazing. And we did the same with the British Patient Capital. And we're inspired by the quality of the team and sort of what's coming out of BPI in France as well. So, I think it's a result of that dialogue, right? And not sort of saying, there's government, there's entrepreneurs, and the two don't meet. So, at least from our view over the last 15 years, it's been a very positive, constructive dialogue with that North Star in mind, which is how do we crowd in the private sector and not crowd it out. And so I think, to again, sort of the question of direct investing, we worked with the London Co-Investment Fund. Again, it does help. It does help, especially in those very kind of risky bets. My sort of view on what I've seen in the last decade, and with the crowding in also of, Bessemer just announced an office in Europe. Sequoia has already announced an office in Europe. All the sort of battery ventures have had offices in Israel for a while. People in London as well. With all that crowding in, I would say the greatest of companies really have their choice these days, and that wasn't true 10 years ago. And the quantum of the greatest companies in Europe now has increased tenfold. Also in the last 10 years or so. That said, there is the whole pyramid below, literally, below that top section, which we continue to be challenged in helping fund, in helping scale. To Johannes's point, I don't think of it as US ownership or Chinese ownership. I think of it as European benefit. So I don't sort of care who owns things, but who's benefiting. And so we do need pension money to come in. We need, that's why we love crowdfunding. The merger of Crowdcube and Seedrs is powerful. I think it's going to be better for Europe, for them to be together. So we think the retail investor, the everyday person, needs much more opportunity to benefit from all the success of Europe.
You talk about crowding out versus crowding in, and Stefan mentioned it as well. But this move towards direct investment, this 3.5 billion figure, I believe they're going to be writing checks of around 500,000 euros to 15 million. It's roughly the same kind of ballpark that Seed Camp is playing in. Is there a worry in your mind as well, that you end up just getting beaten to deals or just more expensive, or is there a sort of message you'd like to pass to Stefan about how not to crowd out?
Yeah, and I think Stefan sort of mentioned it before already, which is, you know, a lot of that co-investing, a lot of the sort of infrastructure, fundamental research in investing that then allows folks like us and downstream to sort of come on top. I mean, there's absolutely a lot of cases, edge cases, where we ultimately don't invest because, you know, I have discussions with some of our portfolio companies who are essentially in R&D with us for 3 years, and then they launch, and I'm like, you know, we love you, but we weren't the right people for you, because you got nothing out of what we do, which is all about commercial. Are you ready to sort of be 6 months from launch? Are you ready to be, you know, a max sort of year from launch? And there is incredible sort of depth in healthcare, in hardware, manufacturing, elsewhere, you know, deep tech, which is even deep tech at the software level, which is not ready to launch in 6, 9, you know, 12 months. And so we absolutely need investment help, you know, prior to that. And on top of that, I mean, we can still be writing sort of that 500K check or $1 million check, or alongside us, right, to make some of those edge case investments. So we're not worried. And I think, again, competition is great. Like, I know, you know, as VCs, we don't love it, but we love it as well. It makes you better. And so what we trade on is our network of 400 plus companies and the 1,000 founders that are out there. We trade on, you know, that peer network. They all kind of recycle talent within each other. They sell to each other, buy from each other. We trade on our kind of mentor network and experience network. And I don't think that's where, you know, Stefan and EIC are intending to play, right? So that capital is additive to all of the efforts we can make on the sort of support side.
Johannes, we're talking about, just picking up on some of Stefan and Reshma's points about the kind of models for investment, be it in LPs or co-investing or direct investment. Do you have a take on what Europe should be doing, how helpful a kind of move towards more direct investment is, or do you think they should be stepping back and changing the regulatory landscape, or just focus on changing the regulatory landscape with, you know, pension funds and options? What's your, as an extremely prominent European founder, what do you kind of see and what do you think people want?
Yeah, let me first respond to Reshma. So, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm not a protectionist, but at the same point in time, I think, you know, when Get Your Guide IPOs and we're a European success story, mostly American pension funds and American endowments will benefit from it. And I think that's a pity for Europe, and it shouldn't be that way, right? So I think that is something that we must change in the future. And I hope that the Get Your Guides 10 years from now will benefit European citizens as much as, you know, we are currently benefiting American and Asian citizens. On your question, without getting into the details, let's stick to the high-level principles. I think that one of the most important principles is that when you handle money from, you know, pension funds, endowments, from the European taxpayer, it should be in the hands of professionals. So I am not a big fan of governments making direct investment decisions. I think governments should fund professional funds, and those funds should be many, and they should be in competition with each other. And you know, ultimately, the money should go where good returns are. So I think that is the first principle. The second principle is what we lack is not only a risk-taking culture. I mean, on the investment side. That is certainly one that I have seen time and again. So if you look at, you know, the big pots of money, you know, for instance, in Germany, where I come from, you know, the life insurances, you know, the Allianzes of the world. I mean, they have, you know, tiny quotas ultimately for venture capital. And that's certainly also a mindset problem. But more importantly, we don't incentivize these investments from a regulatory point of view. And I think, you know, there is a massive benefit to doing that. Not only do I think will you actually invest in, you know, the right assets, because tech assets and innovation will yield much better returns over the next 10 years than if you invest into you know, German companies that produce combustion engines, but also I think you will actually create a digital agenda across Europe and also a tech agenda across Europe that will probably span multiple sectors, and that will be to the great benefit of the future generation. So as a still relatively young citizen of Europe, if I may call myself, I would be incredibly disappointed in us as a continent if we weren't pursuing these type of investments much more aggressively, because otherwise I do think that we really tarnish the future of our children.
What do you think of that, Stefan? Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think one, the regulatory aspect is not something that I work on. So sorry if I cannot really take a strong position on it. But what we have observed is that probably one of the reasons I would say the institutional money, in particular the pension funds, the insurance companies don't go into VCs, is that there is a perception of the VC to be highly risky and to give out, I would say, very uncertain return. And the name of the game when you are in pension funds or insurance company is the steady, predictable returns that you can get. VC is seen for better and for worse as providing, I would say, okay, a good bet one day, a bad bet another day. And this lack of predictability is creating, I would say, a kind of a shyness on the part of the industry. The second aspect of it is that they don't really have teams in place that can help them develop, I would say, sustained effort of investment in the VC sector that will allow them to actually have, I would say, a steady perspective on the returns that they will be able to get, because they will be able to find out, I would say, the better funds to invest in, and therefore to have this predictability of the returns that is the name of the game. And I think that we need probably to advertise better that the VC market has come of age, and that indeed it is not anymore a lottery. It is actually something on which you can bet for predictable return if you just know, if you put enough resources in it, and if you put enough teams in it in order to be able to help you through it. So I would say that aspect would go, in our view, quite a great deal into addressing that particular issue. Otherwise, yes, I tend to agree. I mean, we are in a situation in which today we tend not only to have our best ideas thrive in another market, but on top of that, we tend to then buy those products that have been basically crossing the Atlantic and coming back to us in another war, in another form. And at the end of the day, Europe loses at both angles. We nurture at the level of research and development those ideas. We nurture at the level of the educational system the people and the talent that actually produces those ideas. And then we get very little return out of it, because when the growth and jobs produced by those ideas are taking place, they are taking place not necessarily in Europe and more in America or in Asia. And this is, I would say, a major problem for Europe to be in that situation. So what we are trying to do here with the EIC, I mean, you talked about the European DARPA and the possibility of trying to address it. I mean, of course, DARPA was conceived over the time of the Cold War. So, I mean, the situation is very different today. But the idea is to try to find a European answer to this particular challenge that is being thrown at us, which is that we want the economy of the 21st century would be fundamentally innovation driven. We are good at producing innovation, at nurturing it, but we are very bad at scaling it up and making it market ready for take up by consumers. And this is where we need to fundamentally start to work. It does not mean that the aspect of developing advanced research needs to be given up. The EIC has also an instrument called the Pathfinder that will go and find out those very good ideas based on collaborative projects, or the traditional, I would say, way of bringing together advanced research. But we need to really make a major step up and step up our efforts in order to convert that advanced research into a marketable proposition. And here, to go back on the issue of the crowding in and crowding out, I mean, it was very well summarized. I mean, what we are not going to be able to replace what the commercial VC network can provide, in particular in support to companies, mentoring, soft skills, networking, and so on. We cannot do that. What we need to do is provide the incentives to capture it to the benefit of the company that are considered to be too high risk for the commercial VCs to go in. So in our view, this is, I would say, joining forces operation more than a replacement operation. So by definition, we are there to bring to these companies to the level in which then the commercial VC can make them benefit of all the things that they can offer that indeed today often they cannot do because the commercial VC simply don't have the capacity to cover all these ideas in Europe.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid half an hour seems very short, but that's all we have time for. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. We've heard from Johannes with the 3 key areas about promoting talent, about regulation and level playing field, but also about stimulating sort of an impassioned argument for stimulating investment by helping pension funds and insurance companies. We have this sense of this seismic shift going on in Europe from you, Stefan, towards direct investing and like being more on the front foot with investing, which is fascinating. And then it was just great to hear Reshma talk about all of these issues, but particularly to be very supportive of this co-investing model, and rather than saying, oh, governments go away, stop crowding me out, to be really excited about that, which I think is just fantastic. And then the point about pension funds as well, and Stefan, how we needed to advertise to the world, but particularly these funds, that the VC market is not rolling the dice anymore and it has matured. So it's my little sum up, but also wanted to thank all 3 of our guests so much. And I hope everyone listening stays for the rest of the day. There's some fantastic stuff coming up. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for attending this panel dedicated to IPOs in Europe. I'm Nicolas Collin of the family moderating this panel. So I've been 7 years in the VC space in Europe, and 7 years ago, there weren't many IPOs around at the global level, actually. I remember in 2014, Mark Andreessen talking about all the reasons why most tech companies were delaying their IPO, the regulatory burden, the relative scarcity of investment banks willing to underwrite small early IPOs as they used to exist in the 1980s and 1990s. And then 2 years later, 2016, I was struck by an article in Fortune mentioning that there were more than $600 billion waiting for an exit piling up in Silicon Valley tech companies. So yet only 3 years later, that is last year, there was a series of high-profile IPOs, among them Uber and Pinterest, an attempt by WeWork, which collapsed, as you know. And this year, the pace has only been accelerating for reasons that are all too obvious. The world is awash with cheap money. Companies obviously prefer to go public now rather than after the entire economy might collapse because of the pandemic. And so in this context, here in Europe, we're hearing the same refrain over and over again. We need more IPOs in Europe. Some say we need one of the capital cities, whether Paris, London, Amsterdam, to emerge as the preferred place for European tech companies to go public. Others claim that we need a European NASDAQ to counterbalance the US supremacy on global capital markets. And so this conversation brings together a broad group of participants. So investors are in search of liquidity, founders are in search of more capital and the smashing PR that comes with going public, and policymakers think that we Europeans are not playing in the big league if we don't have more IPOs. So I've learned from my mentor in venture capital, Bill Janeway, that there's no such thing as entrepreneurship and venture capital without public markets. So it's a very important topic. And I'd like by asking a question to Cliff Marriott of Goldman Sachs. So Cliff, you're an investment banker. You're part of this diverse ecosystem that brings together bankers like you, analysts, investors, journalists, PR firms, regulators, and so on. So could you provide us an overview inside this diverse ecosystem in Europe? Where are IPOs happening? Who are all those people working at making them happen? Where does Europe stand when it comes to IPOs as compared to the US?
Thank you, Nicola, and thanks a lot for allowing me to join your panel this morning. Very interesting topic. I mean, first thing I would say is I feel like your introduction was a little bit negative in terms of the IPO dynamics in Europe and the state, let's say the general state of European technology in Europe. I actually am on the complete other side of the planet from you on that front in terms of I've never been more excited about the state of European tech as it stands right now. We're just seeing just fantastic, first of all, at the ground levels, company formation, really interesting things being, or challenges being addressed through new company formation. And then as you work up through the ecosystem in terms of growth stage companies and more late stage companies, just the quality of companies coming out of Europe, accessing the public markets, but also the private markets has never been as exciting. I mean, I look through the deck that I think Sifted put out over the last couple of days, which was a good data piece on the number of companies. I mean, in 2012, I believe it was, there were 20 unicorns as per their definition. And now there's over 200 unicorns in Europe. So that wall of 600 billion of capital that you have, that you talked about in Silicon Valley, I mean, there's an equivalent wall of, I don't know, at least 20 billion, because that would mean, at least 200 billion from Europe. If you say there's 200 unicorns at a billion each, some of those are already listed. But in any event, the number of opportunities for great companies to list in Europe is just phenomenal. And we see as you talked about the dynamics in the market, One of it is the wall of capital, which felt slightly negative. I think of that as a positive thing. There's lots of capital available for growth companies. The second thing is a general understanding by investors, or belief by investors, that technology companies are benefiting from a number of the kind of tailwinds that we're seeing in the market right now. Increased offline to offline movements, increased collaboration, or need for technology to aid in collaboration, like Zoom or whatever platform we're using right now to access this this conference, et cetera, et cetera. And so those trends are accelerating, and a number of technology companies are kind of benefiting from that acceleration of those trends. And investors want access to growth, and technology companies generally, but growth companies more specifically, they provide that growth, and really that's what investors want to access. So that's a really positive thing. To give a couple of statistics, and we have this debate with people, with companies, on whether they would like to list in Europe or list in the US. And I am not a proponent or a believer that we need one exchange in Europe to allow companies to go public. We've taken companies public, great companies public in the UK. If you think about someone like Avast or Just Eat, or if you talk about Netherlands, Adyen, Takeaway.com, which is now over a $20 billion company. You talk about Poland. We just did the largest technology IPO ever in Europe, which was the IPO of Allegro last month, which was $2.8 billion. That was done on the Warsaw Stock Exchange. So if good companies want to go public, they have their choice of going in their home market for the most part, whether that be Paris, Berlin, Paris, Frankfurt, Warsaw, London, or they can access the US markets. And I really think if you're a good technology company, you have ample access to capital.
Thank you, Cliff. Martin, let me turn over to you. So you're a partner at Index Ventures with a focus on the Nordics, if I'm not mistaken. But beyond that, you're part of a prominent firm that has a foothold on both sides of the Atlantic. So we'd like to hear the VC perspective here. So what do you tell your portfolio companies about whether or not they should try and go public, and where they should do their IPOs?
Yeah, thanks, Niklas, and thanks for having me. First, I would say, I agree with the sentiment that Cliff kind of echoed, around the excitement of what's happening. I think if you look at the number of IPOs, it's a bit of a lagging indicators of the health of an ecosystem, because it takes 10 years at least for when things go really well to go from inception to IPO. So all it tells you is how good was the ecosystem 10 years ago, not how good it's been for the past 10 years. And I think that's why Cliff's mention of the number of unicorns, I think is probably a better indicator, even though the term unicorn can be debated. But I think it gives directionally, it gives a good sense for where the European markets is going. In what we tell our companies, I think we've been investing in these businesses typically since the first round or the second round, so at least usually 8 years before the IPO. So we're not in it for a quick flip, clearly. So we're fairly long-term holders, even though at that point, once the IPO, there is a need for liquidity over the next 2-3 years. But clearly, our goal is not to kind of maximize the valuation necessarily at IPO and rush it early. We want companies to go public when they're ready to go public, which means you need a certain scale, you need some certain numbers of controls and of predictability of the business, and so that's our main that's the main criteria. But for us, I would say IPO is the ideal exit route typically, given the size of our fund. We just raised $2 billion before lockdown, so we really need businesses that are going to be worth north of 5, if not $10 billion now to really make an impact for the fund. And there are very few acquisitions of that scale, and so IPOs are the perfect avenue for for our companies.
And what about the place? So what's the advantage of listing in the US for a European company as opposed to listing on their home market?
Yeah, we again, I'm pretty aligned with Cliff in a way that we prefer for our companies to list on their home market if that's where most of their business is. I think it's you want to be typically ideally the closest to your to your customers, to your employees. That there's a large ecosystem around you. We don't really believe in kind of optimizing on the margin for listing locations. And as Cliff mentioned, there have been incredible examples of successful IPOs in Europe. If you look at ADN, obviously is an exceptional company, but they listed in Amsterdam. I don't think anyone would argue that they don't suffer from a discount. If you look at the multiples, they don't suffer from lower quality of investors on their register. If you look at the names, so clearly it is possible. I think there's one category which where I think Europe needs to still break a glass ceiling, which is on pure software to some extent. It is true that if you are an enterprise software company and most of your business in the US, well, most likely it probably does make sense. But the reality is that at that stage, typically your headquarter may be in the US as well. So it's not as if it was a totally absurd thing to do to list in the US market. But I think there's a trend that you've mentioned as well, Nicholas, in your writings multiple times around continental champions, even in the software world. And I think that's going to be another trend that's coming, where we're going to see some very, very large European businesses focusing mostly on the Europe market. And I do believe these companies should be listing in Europe.
Thanks, Martin. Marianne, next question would be for you. So you're part of France Digital, which is an organization formed by French VCs and entrepreneurs to lobby for the interests of the tech sector in France. And there have been moves recently by the French government to try and snatch the IPO market from London in the context of Brexit. So we'll have the minister interviewed by John Thornhill a bit later this morning, who will tell us more about that. But how do you view this discussion? What's the rationale here for trying to have more IPOs in Paris as opposed to London? Do you think that will happen?
Thank you, Nicholas. Well, you can just decide to make Euronext the next tech stock exchange. So tech IPOs happen thanks to a whole ecosystem. Cliff mentioned companies strong enough to be listed, but you also need investment bankers, you also need analysts and PR firms. So what can government and the French government can do to help IPOs happen in France? Well, I see two things. First thing is that the French government can help the ecosystem by creating later stage of growth, later stage VCs, and creation of US growth funds. What I mean is that startups, when they want to reach Series D or Series E, they often turn to US investors. And that's the reason is that Europe lacks strong late stage tech VCs. And once they turn to US investors, they are often asked to create a US topco. And once they've done that, they are asked to list in the US, because the SEC and the IRS created such a lock-in control rules that they cannot list outside of the US. So what can we do if our goal is to have European companies list in France? What can we do? Well, we need to have a strong VC late-stage funds. So I'm not asking Emmanuel Macron to put billions of euros into late-stage funds, but what can be done, and that's what the French government has been doing over the last 2 years, is to compel or ask institutional investors to fund as LPs VCs. And last September, the French government announced that French insurance companies would be investing 5 billion, which actually turned into 6 billion euros, into late-stage funds and French late-stage funds. And that's actually quite a good measure, because having funds just cuts off all the debate over European digital sovereignty or whether or not there should be a control over foreign investments. Well, if you have the money, then you do not need to ask yourself whether there should be control or not. Another thing that can do our government is the fact that is to work on why IPOs exist. And the reason why IPOs exist is because VCs need to exit and investors need liquidity. And by investors, I mean, of course, VCs, investment bankers, but also employees and early investors. And as regards to employee, they need IPOs to exit and cash in all their employee stock options that they received during the moment where they were employees. And we have in Europe such a fragmented options that if we had a unified stock option regime all over Europe, then we could have easily cash in. And that's what Index would be quite interested in with the whole not optional campaign. But that's actually one important things we have in Europe. Les BSPCE, so les bons de souscription, it's your employee stock regime, and let's work on having a unified stock option regime on that.
Thanks, Marianne. Yes, there have been quite a lot of progress both in France and soon in Germany regarding stock options. And obviously IPOs will become all the more appealing when employees are convinced that they can cash out and make more money to compensate for their early efforts at building great products. So let me turn to Gorka Apres. So Gorka, you're with the European Commission in Brussels and you're focused on making local capital markets more supportive for local entrepreneurial ventures. There's this thing called the Capital Markets Union, CMU. And so why, so let me ask it like this. So why does it matter that European companies are listed in Europe rather than the US in your view, and how the CMU Action Plan, how can it help tech and innovative companies being listed in Europe?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Actually, thank you very much for leaving me to the end, because I've been hearing really positive things. So I'm happy that the general tone of the European IPO market is like this, because we really believe that there's a lot of potential in Europe, and that's what we fight for. It's true that in some cases when you make a comparison to the US market, there are a lot of things, and of course we always benchmark to the US because it's the most developed capital market. But I think there's a lot of potential in Europe, and that's what we're trying to fight for with the CMU. So it's actually good that I came just after Marianne, because she mentioned a lot of things which we're actually working on. Unfortunately, the tax issues is something that from a European level we cannot tackle. I agree that a more harmonized approach on a tax level will help definitely to tackle many things, but unfortunately that's something that it's a more national level thing that we cannot tackle at this stage. But on the other things, I'm happy that Marianne mentioned a lot of things, and I'm also happy that Cleve and Martin mentioned things that we're actually working on. So we recently, as you mentioned, we were working on the CMU Action Plan. That was launched in September, last September, so quite recent. And just to focus, because I'm not going to go through all the actions that are mentioned in the CMU Action Plan, but some of the actions that are related to what we're discussing here. So things like, for example, how do we actually intend to make more accessible capital to European companies, and especially to young, high growth, innovative companies like tech companies. So one of the things that we intend to improve is to make access to funding easier by, for example, simplifying the listing rules for public markets. One of the things that we've seen is that there is a high administrative burden. There is a high cost for listing. There's a difficulty for many companies to comply with the listing rules, and that dissuades many companies from going public. So this, in a way, this limits the possibilities for these companies to actually go public, and this makes them more dependent still on bank financing, which is what we're seeing right now with the COVID context. So this has become, so everybody will agree in this discussion that the CMU and the capital markets development in Europe has become even more important with the COVID as a way to make recovery and growth more important right now. The other thing that we're working, and that's also related to one of the points that Marianne mentioned, is that we're working on creating a single access point for data, including not only financial information, but also sustainability related information. That's what we're going to be calling European Single Access Point, or ESAP. And the objective is to reduce the cost of information search, also to give the possibility for other investors, so widen the investor base for those companies that are lacking those institutional investors, like Marianne said. I totally agree that one of the main issues that we find right now is there's a lack of institutional investors going into small companies. And that's actually what we need. Of course, retail investors are important, but institutional investors can make the difference. Also, you've probably heard about this, and that's one of the actions that was mentioned by the President von der Leyen last year, which is the creation of an Sme Ipo Fund. So we also, and I fully agree that there's a need for a connection between late stage VC funds to those funds which are investing into primary markets, so IPOs. So that's something that we're working on. So we intend to create an Sme Ipo Fund in a way to make it easier for companies to raise capital in public markets. It's something that will take time, but we have acknowledged that there is a lot of potential, there is a lot of space, there's a funding gap that we can fill in through the creation of an Sme Ipo Fund. And we actually believe that this Sme Ipo Fund will come in the right time, especially post-COVID, because we see that there's an enormous funding gap on equity, and we need to reduce that dependence on bank financing, which otherwise makes the whole system just systemic. So, and also we're working among other actions just to complement, for example, on making institutional investors more interested into SME equity. And that is something that we've seen, especially institutional investors, including insurers, banks. So we think there's a lack of institutional investors going into SME equity, and that's something that we need to correct. And finally, let me just finalize by saying that this is something that it will take time. I mean, President von der Leyen mentioned that the CMU is a generational project. We think that the saying that Rome wasn't built in just one day, the CMU will take time. Integrating capital markets, it's something that is not easy. It will take many years, because mainly we find that there is a lot of barriers to the single market, which in most instances are linked to culture, they're linked to historical or customs, etc. And we think it will take time, but I think we're on the right track. So thank you very much for leaving me to the end, because I think it came all in the right place.
Thank you. So hopefully progress will be made until this wall of capital that Cliff was mentioning is ready to turn into liquidity. Can I ask maybe one last quick question, especially to Martin and maybe Cliff as well? Is there, while we're waiting for more IPOs to become possible in Europe, is there an alternative? We've seen more private equity firms getting interested in late stage tech companies like Silver Lake or KKR. Should we rely on those while the European IPO market is shaping up?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely not mutually exclusive. I mean, we need to have as many options as possible. You know, not every company is an Adian. You know, every company has a different profile. Obviously, you know, I think you know, if you are extremely fast growing and on a massive market, and you can go public, and that's the desire of your investor base, I mean, that's you know, the best option in many cases. but there are many different situations in between. And so definitely later stage PE, which are already to your point, being a lot more active as growth stage investors, even from Series D onward. There have been multiple cases over the summer, for example, of very large checks being written by more PE type funds, in France, including in France, and then there is obviously the SPAC question, which I think is one of the things that you probably had in mind, which hasn't crossed the Atlantic yet, and where again I think it is a bit of an illustration of how Europe is still a little bit behind in some ways, where it's a phenomenon that seems to be already kind of slowing down in the US and hasn't even got started here in Europe. And whether it's it's a good or a bad thing is a bigger discussion. But at least what it shows is that European markets are a little bit behind on innovation and on trying new things and letting whether it's institutional or retail investors. I think it's something we haven't really mentioned a lot of, which is a big phenomenon in the US. We are investors in Robinhood, and that's deeply transformed the way Americans and stock ownership by individual Americans is multiple times higher than in Europe. And I think my hope would be that Europeans become a little bit more capitalist, and that they realize that that's where growth is going to come from for their wealth as well, and not only in kind of life insurance. So that's my final word.
Thanks. So it's time to wrap up. I think we've heard great perspectives here, quite an optimistic view as to more IPOs on the way, a thriving European tech scene, hunger for liquidity from everyone's part, a more favorable regime when it comes to stock options. So I really hope we can catch up when it comes to innovation. There are still marginal effects like in enterprise software, as you mentioned, Martin, or that lockup effect that once you have a top co in the US, you cannot come back to Europe for being listed. But eventually, it will all be solved over time. So
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Thornhill. I'm the innovation editor at the Financial Times and the founder of Sifted. Really thrilled to be here today for this great event. I'm also delighted to be joined by Cédric O, the Minister for Digital Affairs for France. Thank you very much, Secretary of State, for taking the time to talk to us this morning, particularly at such a difficult time for France, given the recent events in Nice. And I'm sure all our viewers will want to join me in sharing our condolences and solidarity with you. You've done an enormous amount to promote the Tech for Good movement and to put Paris on the digital map of the world. You're going to be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a question and answer session from me and from the audience as well. So I would ask our audience to listen to the presentation and then please pepper us with questions in the chat function. The theme of our conference is Making Europe the Most Entrepreneurial Continent. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say on this subject, Mr. Secretary of State. So, je vous passe la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. At first, I want to thank you for your words on what happened yesterday in Nice. I wish I could have been able to come physically to Slush and to be able to answer the question. Obviously, that's not going to be that year. But I'm really happy to have the opportunity to take the floor in front of you and to maybe share the way we're seeing the unfolding trends on the digital of the digital ecosystem in Europe and worldwide, the way we are approaching it from a French point of view. First issue is, and I think I won't be long on that point, is the importance of tech in the overall economy, but also in the to some extent, international talks that we are having these days. There is no discussion between President Macron and his counterpart, be it Donald Trump or the President of China or any international leaders that does not involve a discussion about tech and the issue that are brought about by the development of the digital world. So tech has become really pivotal for both our economy and our sovereignty, and pivotal finally in the day-to-day lives of our citizens. This is especially what we are seeing and that the whole world is seeing during the lockdown period. And if you look at the competition as this is unfolding on the international scenes, we have seen over the past years a fierce competition between the US and China that is entailing a lot of issues for the European economy, but also for the European sovereignty. That is why France, but also now Europe as a whole, with the action of Commissioner Thierry Breton or Margaret Vestager, for instance, has been laying such an emphasis into being able to get back in the race that we were kicked out of over the past years, and being able not to be at the table, on the table, but to be at the table as the president is putting it. And if we want to be able to get back in the race, we have to invest more. We have to frame our ecosystem and the way this is working in order to make it as competitive as the ecosystem are in the US and China. This is why we've been implementing, as far as France is concerned, a lot of reform as far as taxation on capital gains is concerned, as far as labor market is concerned, as far as investing in some key critical technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and so on, because we need to get back in the race. I think that the overall trend are really good, be it at the French level, but at the European or at the European level. If you look at the French level, the competitiveness of the whole French tech, as we name it, ecosystem is improving quite fast. We have been able to double the amount of money that is invested within the French ecosystem over the past 2 years. France has been semester one, the leading country in the European Union in terms of amount of money that is invested within the French startups, which is the first time over the previous history. And if you look at for the figures such as the number of unicorns, amount of money invested,
but also the trend of people coming back to France, investing to France, the trend of international investors coming to France and considering France as a mature ecosystem. The trends are, from a global point of view, quite good, but this is not enough. This is not enough because if we want to be on a par in the coming years with the US and China, and I speak from a European point of view, we have to do more. And I think this is a question of independence and of sovereignty. If we are not able to be at the right level of commitment, then we will be kicked out of history. And I think this is something that is quite urgent, and I'm really pleased with the new ambition that is supported by the European Commission at the European level. We have to invest more, and we have to be at the right level of commitment. This is absolutely needed and urgently needed. What we have to do and what we want to build, it's their paradoxical trends. We have to be more sovereign but more international. Digital is something that is internationally approached, so we have to be at the right level in international standards in terms of how you the possibility for your startuppers and entrepreneurs. You have to be in the international standards as far as taxation is concerned, and so on and so on. This is also why I think that Europe has to work on its attractiveness, especially taking into account the trends that are unfolding in the US or in other countries. I think that we have an opportunity. We have an economic opportunity because the economic mood in the US is not as good as it used to be. And because the European model, which is different from the American one and the Chinese one, is really attractive in a period that is quite difficult for all the people all around the world. And I think that that the balance that we have in Europe with the quality of living, public services, but also an area where you can innovate and entrepreneur can find the right framework is something that we have to build on. This is imposing us to ease some regulation. This is imposing us to get back into international standards, as I mentioned. But I think that we have a huge opportunity. And I'm really optimistic for one major reason is that the battle and the competition for tech is at first a competition for human intelligence and for people. And the trend that we are seeing these days are really encouraging in terms of attractiveness of Europe and especially of France in terms of talent. Europe and France have historically been producers of talents that to some point were going to the US to develop and to create companies. What we are seeing that those talents have now the framework and the environment in France and Europe to develop the next giants or the next tech champions here without being forced to travel abroad. And I think this is the most encouraging. Last words that I want to say is that I think that there is also another thing on which we have to be working as a community, and the whole tech ecosystem should work on it, is the responsibility of the ecosystem. I think that we are seeing all over the Western world questions about the impact of tech on the society, on inequality, on environment, on diversity. And I think that if the tech ecosystem is not able to take over those questions and to be more diverse, more caring more about this impact, then this will be a huge issue in the coming years. And I think that if tech is not able to transform and to be more diverse and to show that this is onboarding the general interest, we will have more Brexit, we will have more yellow vests in France, we will have more anger of the redneck in the US. And I think this is something that we have to onboard. Otherwise, this is not going to be a sustainable situation. To conclude, I would say that I think that building an international and a worldwide ecosystem takes time. And what we are seeing unfolding this day in France, but also in Europe, is something that has been built over the past 10 previous years. And this is the same went for the Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was founded in 1950 after the launch of Sputnik by the USSR. And so this is normal that even if we are a little bit lagging behind, it takes time to get back in the race. But there is, to some extent, a sedimentation effect. And we are reaping the fruit now of something that has been started over something like 10 years ago. And I think with the network effect, we will see in the coming years more and more results of what we are doing, but we have to keep up with the pace and to keep up with the reform if we want to be able over the next 10 years to build something international.
Thank you very much, Secretary. I think you raised a lot of very interesting issues. I particularly want to focus on this seeming paradox of you stressing sovereignty and internationalism and your emphasis on human intelligence. So we'll come back to some of those issues. But I'd like to start off, soon after you became Minister for Digital Affairs last year, you gave an interview in which you said, if we want our children, our grandchildren to get jobs, we can't do it without startups. Now, I used to work in Paris as the bureau chief at the Financial Times from 2004 to 2009. And at that time, I think startups were seen as somewhat kind of quirky, exotic creations. They weren't really central, I think, to the kind of French economy and ecosystem. Tell me, how much has that changed now? How much are startups at the center of French economic policy? And how do you think you are putting an emphasis on that?
Well, I think that the mood in Paris has dramatically changed since 2009. And it is something that has been, to be honest, transpartisan for the past 10 years, but there has been a huge acceleration with the election of Emmanuel Macron for two reasons. The first reason are hard science figures. I mean, reforms on capital and taxation gain, reforms on labor market, and so on, a number of reforms that have eased the business environment and make it one of the most attractive over continental Europe, has brought about a rise in the economy. First issue, and the results were crystal clear. France has been, for the first time in 2019, the first destination over in Europe of foreign investment, and it was considered one of the most favorable countries in terms of foreign investment by foreign investors in the world, and one of the countries that has improved the most its attractiveness. But I think the second thing that is maybe even more important is the emphasis that has been laid by the president himself on the entrepreneur, and saying and supporting and advocating for the fact that entrepreneurs are the future of France. If you take the size of the challenge, I just want to mention one figure, that the last IPO of a tech company over 1 billion euro valuation in France was 1996. It was Dassault Systèmes. It tells you everything of what we have been what we have failed on, and what the government, the French government, have failed over the past years. And so this is why we have been completely overhauling our approach, saying yes, we have to transform our big business legacy businesses such as LVMH, Renault, Safran, Airbus, but we have to be able to make new champions and new business emerge. Otherwise, we will be kicked out of this. Mm-hmm. And we have been inputting a lot of energy, and with not only have we been able to talk the talk, but also to walk the walk, since we introduced a lot of reforms. But I think the energy and this stage of the president himself telling the entrepreneurs, we want you to stay, and we want you to build international business and new big techs here, was really, really important.
Now, you focused on how much has changed over the past decade, which is unquestionable, I think. I was looking at a recent study, though, of McKinsey, which showed that although Europe had accounted for about 36% of all startups globally over the past decade, it only accounted for 14% of the unicorns last year that there were in the world. And they identified a kind of funding gap. Europe is very good now at creating startups, but it's not particularly good at scaling them. And we've heard from previous sessions in this conference about this kind of lack of scale-up financing, the inability to take promising startups to kind of global level. What do you think Europe can do to address that?
Well, I think it's a sedimentation effect. If you take the French example, for instance, we have 10 unicorns. If you define them by the books, 6 have became unicorns over the past 2 years. So there is an acceleration of the number of unicorns. We had a goal 2 years ago, which was to have 25 unicorns over 2025. This is no longer a goal because we will outperform it. Now our ambition is to have decacorns or 20, 30, $50 billion worth companies. And I think that this is changing every day. And the fact that when you are building an ecosystem, this is a sedimentation process. And when you have network effects, then you reap the fruits, is making me very optimistic. If you look at another figures that is really telling for me, is that if you look at the unicorn, the French unicorns, the French unicorn to be, there are something like 40 unicorns to be in France, which are companies that are valuated between 500 million and 1 billion. They all have international investors, such as worldwide known venture capital funds at their capital, in their capital. 2 to 3 years ago, when a foreign VC would invest in a French company, it would ask the company to flip and to take the headquarters to put it in the US. This is no longer the case. And if you look at examples such as Snowflakes or Datadogs, which were created by French founders, those founders gave an interview a few weeks ago, and they said, we had to move to the US. We created the company 5 to 10 years ago. We had to move to the US to make a worldwide company at the time. Now we're considering that if we want to create a company, we will stay in France. And I think those are really the most hard science figures or facts that shows you that the mood has changed. We are still lagging behind. I think that we have to be completely clear. We are lagging behind, and we need more financing, more unicorns. But I think that the underlying trends are really good. First thing. And second thing is that I don't think that, at least as far as France is concerned, there is an investment gap. I think that now when you're running a good business in France, you find financing, be it from a French investor or international investors. The average amount of the tickets that are invested in France have been drastically growing. And we have been seeing over the past weeks rounds of 200 million worth or 100 million worth rounds. So I'm not worrying anymore about private money. What I think we have to unlock, but this is also a sedimentation process, is IPOs. I think that we have to see listed companies that are 20 billion, 50 billion worth company. And this is still what we are a little bit lagging behind, but I think that the overall trend will unlock the problem in the coming years.
Right. I'd like to return to the issue that you stressed in your speech about being both more sovereign and more international. And you hear a lot of talk at the moment around Europe about the importance of technological digital sovereignty. I'd like you to explain to us, what does that exactly mean, and what do you expect from the forthcoming Digital Services Act from the EU?
Well, I think that sovereignty means independence and ability to choose. If I am straightforward, what we see with the, how to put it, instability of the US in terms of decision should force Europe to have European choices. And we have to be on the whole technological value chain able to have European providers. This is not the case. There are a lot of critical technologies, such as the cloud or AI, where we're really lagging behind. So if we need to continue to work with American companies. I think that the idea is not to kick them out of Europe. That would be completely crazy. But I think that we have to have the choice. And at least this is an international question. If you look at, for instance, 5G equipment, I think this is a problem for the US not to have any US providers in 5G equipment. But the same goes for Europe in cloud or in artificial intelligence or in some key critical technologies where we don't have the choice. So I think building the choice takes time. That's why we need to invest now, maybe not to compete on the past technological battle, because sometimes it will be too hard to bridge the gap, but in the next one. That's why, for instance, France is pushing so hard on critical investments in AI, in quantum computing, in cybersecurity, because those are the next technological horizons.
Now, you mentioned cloud computing there, and there has been a big Franco-German initiative to promote Gaia X as a kind of alternative European infrastructure. Can you tell us about that? I mean, are you really going to compete against AWS or Microsoft in this area?
Well, I think that cloud is one of the most challenging, one of the biggest challenges that we are facing, because this is one of the areas when I don't know if Europe has lost the war, but at least it has lost a lot of battles. What we say with Gaia X and that Gaia X initiative with German is not that we want to kick out the American cloud provider. This would be a nonsense. Is that two things. First, we want to be able to build European cloud providers that have the highest ability to offer us a choice, first issue. And second issue is that we have to build standards that makes us, or makes European companies, but also government, independent in terms of choice. Be it between American or European cloud providers, but also between American providers. Because there is that silo approach in cloud that is a huge issue of concern for us. So, so Gaia X is both an industrial approach, but also a standardization approach.
Okay. You're also talking about, in the Digital Services Act, one of the main thrusts is kind of sharing of data, forcing big tech companies to share their own data sets with other people. Can you tell us more about that? I mean, what is the idea behind that?
Yeah, I think that regulation of tech is something that is an international concern. I've been traveling to the US a few months ago before the COVID crisis, and I met with a lot of US academics, regulators, or former regulators and companies. And the question of the fact that some companies, that could be US, but also Chinese, but I hope that we will have the same issue with European companies. The footprint of those companies on our economy and even on our democracy has become too big. So they have to be regulated for what they are, which is what we call structuring companies or gatekeeper companies, or companies that have a footprint on our economy that is too big. To some extent, we have been doing that in other domains over the past decades on companies that were having the hand on what we call vital infrastructure. So the goal of the DSA, which is led by Commissioner Thierry Breton and Commissioner Margrethe Vestager, is to put a new framework of regulation. Actually, there are two texts. The first one is the DSA, Digital Services Act that you were mentioning. And there is also the Digital Market Act that is focusing on competition. I think we have to unlock competition. That would entail to open up some the process or the way some companies are working in order to input more competition into to some areas or some economical domain, and to be able to downgrade the footprint that they have on the economy, because they have become they are in a monopoly or in an oligopoly situation, and they have become so important that they are now gatekeepers of some part of the economy.
Would you favor the breakup of some of those big tech companies?
I think that we all agree at the European level that breakup is a solution, but this is an ultimate solution. And I think that if we want to address on the short term the issues that are raised, the issues that are raised by those companies, we should focus more on the break them open approach than on the breakup approach. I think breakup is something that is at first legally uncertain, takes a lot of time. I recall the fact that when the IBM issue was addressed, or even the Microsoft issue was addressed at in the US, it took, I think, 15 to 20 years. And well, you can cut something, but it will regrow, and we have in the winner takes it all economy. So I think the issue is much more on how you frame an ex-ante regulation that makes, that allows you to regulate the business models of those companies.
Now, as an Englishman, I have to raise the very painful issue of Brexit. You gave an interview with Sifted earlier this week in which you said, Brexit is a huge opportunity for us. Can Paris overtake London as the startup capital of Europe?
I think this is a goal. I think that in the tech ecosystem, nobody is competing to be number two. So as everybody in Europe, the UK, Germany, Italy, we are competing to be number one. And this is really I don't think that any entrepreneur is starting a company thinking that it will be number two. The same goes for countries. But I think that we have to be in a co-competition. I mean, each European country has to be as competitive as it can be in terms of framing an environment for the entrepreneurs, the worldwide entrepreneurs, that is attractive enough to build European tech champions on the European soil. But we have to be able to work together in order to define a level playing field that makes Europe, especially the EU, since there is a single market, as attractive as possible. But if Germany is improving its competitiveness, I'm really happy with it, because I think that it will make Europe stronger. But from a European point of view, obviously, France is not competing to be number two. If we are honest, the British ecosystem is leading the way in Europe so far, has been leading the way. And if you look at the amount of money that is invested within startups in the UK, it's much higher than in France. But the overall trend is quite good for France, and we want to continue with it.
One of the things that your government has done is introduce a very kind of friendly policy on visas and focusing on that human intelligence that you were talking about earlier. How is that going? How is that enabling you to attract talent from around the world?
Well, from a qualitative point of view, we have very, very good feedbacks of major French startups, or even of foreign startups set up in France that have branch companies in France.
Do you have any numbers on that at all you can share?
I do not have any numbers to share, but every entrepreneur that I'm talking with I'm discussing about the French tech visa is really happy with it, and we consider it now the most open tech visa all over the world. To give you an idea, I have a number which is that 900 companies have been taking advantage of that visa. I don't know the number of persons that were concerned, but 900 companies. And to give you an example, I was talking with a French entrepreneur a week ago that told me that he wanted to hire someone, I think it was from Nigeria, that was working in the US for a US company, and to take him to Paris. From the day he started the process to the day till the day when the person and his family set a foot in France, it took 15 days. So this is an example of what we have to be able to achieve. We see that there are immigration issues for the tech ecosystem in the US or even in UK, and we think that if we want to build something international in France, then we need more international talents. So that's why we have been designing that whole process.
Now, we have a number of questions coming in from the audience, and some of them are really focusing on the lack of a European single market, whether it's issues like tax or registration of companies or the allocation of stock options and the treatment of stock options. We are still an incredibly fragmented market in Europe. What is the French government and the EU more generally going to do to address those kind of issues?
Well, I think that's the real issue. If we want to be able to be at the critical size of investment and to build a market that allow our entrepreneurs to build to compete on a par with their American counterpart, strengthening the single market is something that is really needed. And it's always too slow, but we have been able to make progress over the past years. The issue, to be honest, is that the question is not the digital single market, because a company that is operating in healthcare wants a single market of health, of the health environment. A company that is operating in digitalizing education wants a single market of education. It will take time, because I don't think that the European peoples are ready to have a single market for health or a single market for education. But things are improving over the time, especially as far as capital markets are concerned. This is the first issue. And this is also why we are advocating at the European level, for instance, on stock options. I think that in France that we have been able to design a stock option environment that is maybe not on a par with the US environment, but is really interesting, that is almost on a par with the US environment. And this is something that we are advocating to build at the European level, because we think that being able to attract talent is the beginning of everything.
Mm-hmm. We have an interesting question here from Rayam Mustafi, who asks that there are lots of countries around Europe doing very interesting things in the tech space, and points to Estonia and Finland and so on in particular. What can European countries learn from each other and kind of pooling best practice?
Well, what is really interesting with Estonia is the way the state is functioning, and how digitalized public services have been able to foster the development of private services, digital private services. I think to this regard, Estonia is an example for the whole world. But well, to some extent, I think it's a little bit harder to digitalize the French administration with its 100 years history than to build from scratch a digitalized administration. I think that what we are facing now and what Europe is I'm quite optimistic about Europe being able to make new champions in Europe, to be honest. I think that European entrepreneurs are the best. I think that the European engineers are the best. And I think that if we are able to keep the talents, it will be okay. What I'm much more worrying on is the digitalization and the transformation of both the legacy business, our big companies, we have a lot of them in France, and digitalization of the society. Because there is a digital divide or the digital gap within the society, and this is the Brexit, and this is the yellow vest in France, and this is the 30% of the population that feels not on board. Just to give you some figures, in France, one person over six never uses a computer. So there is a sixth of the French population that is not using a computer. There is a third of the French population that is lacking basic digital knowledge. I think that if we want, so we have to be able to build the most favorable ecosystem for our entrepreneur, and then let them do the work, and it will happen. What we have to be able to take care of at the European level from a state point of view is the rest of the population. Otherwise, we will see a growing anger. So we have to take everybody up and to be able to ensure our people that they will be on board of the digital revolution. And I think that is really what we have to be able to do from the state point of view and from a European point of view, but because I think that everybody is sharing the same issue.
Okay, I have an interesting question from Jake Benford, who's asking, is it possible, and if so, how, to steer tech innovation towards meeting societal needs? How can we ensure that kind of tech innovation addresses the big challenges, whether it's climate change or healthcare, rather than just providing money for the next pizza delivery app?
Well, I think that is up to the entrepreneurs. I'm not sure this is completely up by state to the state. And I think that when I see the French tech ecosystem, which is the one I know the most, I see that more and more entrepreneurs are tackling environmental or societal issues. And the way they see their mission has drastically changed. They see their impact as something that is one of the most important KPIs in their business. And that makes me really optimistic. I think that state has a responsibility to be able to, when something is emerging, to take it to the right level, to generalize the use of something. But I think the real solutions won't come out of the state. The real solution will come out of the change of the state of mind of the entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You were talking there about the importance of Europe asserting its sovereignty, mostly vis-a-vis America, but clearly and China as well. I mean, we've had the whole example of Huawei. We've also had the issue of TikTok and what's happened in the US. What do you think should happen in France and Europe with TikTok?
Well, first, there is no parallel between the US and China. The US are competitors, and we have to have our own independence, but they are our allies. So I don't want to put at the same level China and the US. We don't have any problem with China. We are trading with them. They are friends, but the US, it's much more than that. They are our genuine allies. So I don't. We are laying the emphasis on the European sovereignty, but there is no parallel between US and China. This is the first thing I want to do. Mm-hmm. Well, on TikTok, and to have to wait my words, but my personal opinion on TikTok and on the technological debate that we are seeing is that you cannot make a parallel between core telecommunication equipments and a social network for youngsters. So from a French point of view, the US are a great country. They do what they want with their decision, but we don't see a huge issue about the TikTok with the European sovereignty. What we need TikTok to do is to be able to fight at the right level of commitment, hate speech and sexual harassment and the problems that we are seeing unfolding in those social networks. But there is obviously a discussion on 5G equipment, and France and all the European countries have been taking strong measures. And we understand why this is so important from a sovereign point of view. I'm not sure we share the same approach as far as TikTok.
Okay, we're running out of time, so this is probably the last question, but what are some of the most important lessons you have personally learned over the past few years about the policies that have had the biggest impact on startups? Where do you think governments really can make a difference?
I think that the most important thing that we have been doing is showing love to entrepreneurs. I think that obviously the reforms that we have been undertaking and that are huge from a French point of view. I think that taking down some taxation that we have been having and that were French specialties over the past decade is really something really important. But actually, it only gave credibility to the message that the president has been carrying. And the most important was the message. And the most important thing that we have been doing, and which is, I think, our most important asset, is the fact that for the president himself, entrepreneurs are the future of France. And that no matter what is unfolding in other domains, we have to take care of them. And we have to tell them that they are the future of France. And I think this was the most important thing. This is much more psychological than economical. And the reforms that we have been taking were only backing that approach. And it showed people that we were not only talking the talk, but also walking the walk. And it was also something important because we have an ongoing change in the state of mind of the administration. And I think this is the most important part of what we are doing. The leadership issue.
A number of people have suggested that this latest COVID crisis has kind of accelerated the future, that we have kind of vaulted into this digital future more quickly than we would otherwise have done. Is that right, do you think? And I mean, it sounds a terrible thing to say that there are opportunities created by a crisis, given that so many people have tragically lost their lives. But what can we now do to build back better from where we are?
Well, I think the basic question that we have to answer is who will take advantage of the biggest advantage of the crisis. If we look at backwards, the American big techs have built a part of the power on the crisis of 2008. So the question that we have to answer now is how we frame the environment for our startups and our entrepreneurs in order for them to be able to be those who win over the crisis.
Okay. I think we must draw it to an end there. But I think you've raised some incredibly interesting issues. The importance of really developing and making sure that the digital single market works properly. The importance of human intelligence. Europe is stuffed full of extraordinarily talented tech entrepreneurs who need to have their say. And as you say, they have to be shown more love. And I think that you've made quite clear that Europe is moving incredibly fast in this new area. I guess the overall question is Europe moving fast enough given the speed at which other people are moving. But Mr. Secretary of State, thank you very much for joining us this morning and sharing your thoughts with us.
Hello, everyone, and good morning from a very grey London. Very pleased to be here today for the closing session of this event. I think usually in physical events, this will be the session that stands between people and a refreshing beverage or food of some sort. So perhaps it's one advantage to being online. It's probably a little bit early in the day to be supporting Europe's wine industry. However, I hope some of you at least have a very nice cup of tea or coffee in front of you. So I'm Linda Griffin. I run Global Public Policy for King. It's a European-founded games developer, and I'm also co-founder of the European Tech Alliance. It's my very great pleasure to introduce André Azevedo, the first Portuguese Secretary of State for Digital Transformation. You're very welcome, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Hello, Linda, from this very sunny Lisbon. Yeah, as you can see, we have to cover the windows because it's the sun outside. It's amazing today.
That's a good problem to have, and we will definitely get to that. So look, let's dive in. Before we look ahead at Portugal's presidency, I'd like to hear about recent developments in country. In Europe, we try very hard to be the sum of our parts, but I think in terms of the digital market, we are still very much the individual parts of that sum. Our approaches and rules, as we've seen at this event, vary greatly across the EU. So like yourself, I am from a small state that has seen strong per capita growth in terms of the digital sector, from promoting our own startups to attracting regional and international investment. But it's easy to say we're a small country, we can be nimble, we can do things bigger countries can't. What makes Portugal unique from other member states? What is it that you're doing differently, you think, in terms of growing the digital economy?
Well, thanks for that question. We truly believe we have a different approach to digital, and above all, we have a very clear political priority to digital, just like Ireland also and other countries in the European Union. But in our case, it's pretty clear. We have created for the first time, as you have mentioned, Secretary of State for the digital transition, which shows that this is one of the top priorities of our government, and it didn't start 1 year ago, it started, in fact, several years ago. We have a new action plan for digital transition, which is aimed to congregate all the initiatives and articulate all the different initiatives that we want to promote to be consequent and intentional in terms of digital agenda. We have created a new mission unit to coordinate this action plan, and we have strong public and European investment on digital initiatives, pretty much aligned also with the European top priorities. But above all, I would emphasize this holistic approach to digital. I think it's also relevant the scale of our country. We have probably the right dimension. It's something that many of the international companies and investors mention in the case when they decide to go for Portugal. They basically emphasize the right dimension to test, to experiment, to work as a test balloon for new concepts, and this before they sometimes make the rollout for the world. It's also important to emphasize our stability. We have a pretty much stable democracy with a government that's been able to complete the 4 years mandate for several years, and this is something that is also reflected at the social, economic, political level. As you know, we have also this very important tourism hype before the pandemic arrives, but in fact this was something that put us on the map and became all the eyes, and many investors visited us, and they had the privilege of having and taking direct contact with this reality. And I would also emphasize that we started this journey 10 years ago. In fact, we didn't start it 2 years or 3 years ago. We started a long time ago. And the consistency of investing in this area, believing that we need startups ecosystem to promote and invest on R&D to make a transition in our economic model was very, very important. And we have several successful programs that we have also initiated in Portugal, being the first one, the startup visa, which is aimed to attract more talent. We have been many digital nomads as we have assisted to their moving to Portugal, which was a very good contribution to the brain power that we have nowadays in Portugal. And at the same time, we invested a lot in our education system and in our public universities and polytechnics to make sure that we have also, for this year, we have the record ever of number of students in the universities. We have more than 50,000 students, which is very relevant, and it's a consistent investment in these areas. And we have, for the two new initiatives we want to launch in the coming months, which is the e-residency 2.0, that we expect to compete directly with Estonia to capture this very important community of investors and entrepreneurs, that we expect to make it different. We call it 2.0 because it will be entirely virtual. We will not require the need to go to an embassy or to a consulate to be able to get the Portuguese virtual residency or identity. That is something that we're working on. And finally, we are creating this concept of free zone for technology, in which we expect to promote clusters of industries, in which we expect to have or to offer regulatory sandboxes that will be a very strong contribution to capture investment, to test, to experiment, and to develop new projects.
I see. So you're really focusing on finding the ways to get the right people to Portugal, but also then setting up the structures for them to do what they need to do. That's interesting in terms of obviously the pandemic at the moment. I think the broader societal and economic effects of the pandemic are yet to be measured. We're still not sure what they will mean for us, but what we are definitely seeing is that the expansion of remote working is letting people make changes to their quality of life and well-being in ways that they just couldn't before. So I think packed, speaking as someone who lives in London, packed commuting, expensive housing, cold winters, these are all factors that have been part and parcel of working in some of Europe's largest and most successful tech hubs. But so do you feel then that Portugal is well positioned to offer Europe's entrepreneurs who now have perhaps, and just tech workers, not just the founders, who have perhaps more flexibility? Can you offer them a different quality of life as well as opportunities to grow their business?
Yes, globally, I would say that Portugal offers a very interesting value proposition for this kind of entrepreneurs. We know that we are not only considered the third most peaceful country in the world, which is very relevant for people who appreciate stability and good quality of life, but at the same time, in terms of talent, of human resources, we have now a very interesting community that is able to fulfill the needs of international investors that are looking for our country to develop their projects and initiatives. There's also the fact that we've been working to capture significant events that help us to develop this bet on startups ecosystems, on this transition to this new model. I'm talking about, for example, the Web Summit, that we have managed to keep it in Portugal until 2028, and it was a very important landmark and a flagship initiative that has positioned Portugal in the map also for the startups ecosystem, and that's been showing quite a successful bet from our government and from our community. We have a very strong startup ecosystem that has been growing consistently over the past years. It represents at this moment more than 1% of our GDP, and we expect to double it in the next coming 3 years. As I also mentioned, we have several initiatives that aims to support and accelerate this capturing and attraction of new investors.
There's a lot of real positives there, and I think the fact, as you pointed out, that Portugal's been working on this is not an overnight group of initiatives. This is something you've been working. We don't found tech hubs overnights in garages. We slowly build them through trial and error. But what are the key challenges for Portugal in terms of growing your digital economy? What are the big obstacles?
I would say that we need to be even more intentional on our strong belief that digital can play a very relevant role on our transition to a new model of economy. We know that digital and startups typically work in counter-cycle. Recent studies that we made in our startups community show that startups have been able to grow and take advantage of many opportunities even during the pandemic. And we know that the explanation for this counter-cycle effect results from the fact that these startups have invested a lot in terms of human resources, much more differentiated, and at the same time they have incorporated technology in their business models that makes these startups in terms of approach to the market much more resilient and at the same time much more immune to the crisis. And this is something that was confirmed in this study. 42% of our startups mentioned that they have been able to accelerate and to grow during the pandemic crisis. But I believe that both Portugal and at the same time Europe, we share the same challenge and still faces some kind of difficulty in retaining the startups headquarters in Europe when they really want to grow. When they become bigger, when they want to reach the unicorn level, they typically tend to go to the US, to the United States, and this is something that we must try to revert, because we are basically draining many of our resources and our capacity and our capital to other continents instead of keeping them and retaining them in our country. So we consider that it's crucial as a country and as a continent, as European Union, that we are more intentional in the definition of and the creation of the conditions for a more stable and more clear ecosystem for startups, namely through what we consider a very important initiative that is aligned with Europe, that we call the European Startup Nation Standards, that basically defines the requirements for a real startup nation. In our case, we believe that we are in a very interesting stage in terms as a startup nation that we believe we already are. But it's important that as a whole, the Europe has this concern, ensuring that there is a minimum level of investment in this area in all countries and a very significant harmonization in terms of approach to startups ecosystem. Because we still tend to see a very fragmented approach. When a startup wants to internationalize in Europe, they still need to deal with very different regimes, and this is not something that supports and accelerates the growth of these companies.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. We're getting better at creating great hubs for startups to get to a certain size. And how they grow and scale after that seems to be a separate problem, but actually they're totally connected. Scaling is an essential part of longevity of our startups. So that brings...
In our case, we have created a network of incubators that is aimed to somehow help on the increase in terms of maturity of our ecosystem. We have 160 incubators in the whole country, covering the entire territory, and they have been able to support each other and to have a combined approach. And I think this is something very relevant that we should also do at the European level. We need to promote the partnership between incubators from different countries, because that is something that will close the relationship and help the startups that want to enter into other markets from other countries.
I see. Well, that brings us nicely to, I suppose, the looking ahead part. On the 1st of January, Portugal is going to take over the presidency of the Council of the European Union for the first 6 months of the year. And while I know 6 months is not a very long time, it's a very important time in the calendar of the European Union. It's quite auspicious timing. It coincides with the release of and debate on some really large new files around Digital Services Act, artificial intelligence, data strategies. These are intended to be the new rules that will be the backbone of Europe's tech economy in the coming decades. So, the release of these rules for debate coincides with your leadership. With so many big files on the table, what will be the priority for the Portuguese presidency?
We want to focus on two different areas. First being to conclude and to accelerate the approval of these very significant legal instruments that you just mentioned, the Digital Services Act, the document on artificial intelligence and data strategy. Those are the dossiers and files that we want to accelerate and close if possible during our presidency. But I would like to highlight another area of focus that we believe it's crucial for the success of the approach of Europe in terms of international relevance, in terms of our position in the international and global market. We truly believe that Europe should reposition itself, taking advantage of something that I believe we haven't been able to sell internationally, which is the European way of doing business. We know that any market depends on the confidence, on trust. Consumers, companies need to trust, and we are in a certain moment in which trust can be somehow affected by so many news, so many concerns, so many areas in which some lack of regulation can mean some lack of also trust in this ecosystem. And Europe has been regarded and perceived as a continent that hasn't been able to be very effective and very innovative. And we believe that having this legacy of democratic values, of respect for individual rights, is something that when other countries look to Europe is something that is very relevant. And that can be also from an economic approach be regarded as something, a competitive advantage from Europe when compared to US or to China. We truly believe that our values, our democratic principles, our respect for individual rights can be our topic of and our most relevant competitive advantage when compared to these other markets. And so we want to promote a manifesto for a declaration, a Lisbon declaration to be signed in Lisbon in June, that is supposed to somehow materialize this vision of a digital democracy with a purpose that is aimed to ensure that even in the digital era, even in a digital market, we still have a reference. We still want to make sure that people feel they can trust in this digital market, but we want to use this to open to other markets. We want to invite other non-European countries to come to Europe and understand that we are the trustful partner for them to make business in the digital era. And we want also this Lisbon Declaration to be subscribed by big tech companies that on a self-regulation approach also assume the commitment of aligning with these basic principles that are crucial for the confidence in these markets. And this is something that we expect to have this great momentum that will happen in June. And it will also be associated with another very relevant momentum for Europe, which is the inauguration of a submarine cable that will link Europe and Latin America. And it will be also inaugurated together with the Digital Assembly in Lisbon. And it will somehow be a symbol of this direct connection, non-intermediate connection between Europe, Africa, and Latin America, creating this new platform for the South Atlantic, in which we believe that we should invest a lot more, because it's something that will be very crucial for a new cycle of cooperation, will be crucial for the emerging economies that need this support from the digital and are looking for Europe as their reference and their trustful partner that can support them in their digital transition.
You raised a lot of great points about, I suppose, community and supporting each other. So I thought your point about, tech hubs across Europe need to be more aligned and not just in country. It's about how do we connect them across countries. These are the practical ways that we can support businesses who want to stay and scale here and also attract ones from outside of Europe. I think we often focus on comparing ourselves in Europe with the US and China, and we have different ways of measuring how good we are or beating ourselves up for where we're lacking and falling behind. So on my final question, and we've, I think, just 2 more minutes, is what do you see as success for Europe on a global tech scale? How will we measure our success? Is it by the number of unicorns, IPOs? If you don't mind answering in a kind of a short answer, very big question. How do you think we should measure our success here on the digital front?
Okay, there are different approaches to that. Obviously, the percentage of GDP, we can consider the number of jobs that we create with this digital economy. The number of startups is also a very good sign of how the vitality of our ecosystem and our economy. But above all, I would like that European, I truly believe in this, we must sell Europe or reposition Europe as the trustful partner. we have a very important legacy of respect for individual rights that is crucial for the trust that all the consumers, all the companies need to have in this digital market. And this is something that we really would like to emphasize and to contribute to accelerate to this new cycle of cooperation and the international economic relations between Europe and other continents, in which the digital is the base of this new economy.
That's
why we, thank you.
Well, look, thank you for your time. And I think we all wish Portugal the very best of success with its presidency. As we said, it's a really interesting and important time in terms of public policy supporting Europe startups. So I would like to hand over to Wojtek for the closing remarks. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you very much for your time and for your questions.
So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining. We had about 3,000 people join from 50 different countries. And it's been a fantastic discussions from Thursday and Friday. My name is Wojtek. I work at Index Ventures and I'm one of the coordinators of the Not Optional campaign. And what I wanted to share with you is a little bit why we started Not Optional and why it is even called Not Optional. It is because when you travel across Europe, it's not that you encounter lack of enthusiasm and lack of support or will towards startups and to wanting to build more European tech giants. However, it's not always a priority. It's not always seen as urgent. And that's what we try to bring to this. We try to make sure that policymakers see that there are no 5 ways about building the economy of the future to benefit from the job growth, the innovation that it will bring. There is really only one way, and that is to support the young, unproven businesses, the founders that are starting them and helping them scale. So I hope this conversation was insightful. We made some news, as you heard from the German Finance Ministry. Germany will shortly in a matter of days announce new stock option policy. We heard that Latvia is working on theirs, Netherlands as well. And we know that the European Union and the European Commission will, during the Portuguese presidency, announce the Startup Nation standard. So there is definitely building momentum and we need to continue it. So please, if we can help you and support you in local countries, let us know. We would be very pleased to do that. I know that there is a lot of efforts happening by startup associations, some of them who've joined us today, by founders who are very passionate about this. But it is only if our voice is heard all across Europe that we'll be able to make Europe the most entrepreneurial continent. I want to thank Slush, who has been an extremely supportive organization for Not Optional and has helped us co-host this event. The fantastic nonprofit run by students from Finland, and I hope we get to go yet again to Helsinki next year. I also want to thank all the speakers. We had ministers, we had founders, startup executives, members of startup associations, all coming together in a way that I don't think we've previously been able to do. Maybe that is one silver lining of these virtual events, that we can bring all these stakeholders together. I also want to thank our production company, Cmu, Emma Williamson on the logistics of the events, my colleagues Avron and Haley. But mostly I want to thank all of you who have joined in, participated. We will be posting all these sessions live, so you can rewatch them if you missed anything. Thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you soon.